So please join me in welcoming Mr. Derek Leathers.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. First, I want to thank NITL for having me down here, and Jennifer and the team for thinking of us and Werner. Hopefully we can add some value. As she mentioned, what we're going to try to talk about today is maybe a 30-minute overview of the landscape and the problems and kind of why they are what they are and how we got here. And then it'll be more of a Q&A kind of give and take, hopefully, on our view, my view, on how we might get ourselves out of this. What are things that are going to be key to those companies that are successful managing through this crisis or this capacity shortage, and what things we might want to avoid. There we go. All right. So just a little bit about Werner, just to level set. Publicly traded truckload company, she talked about that. We're more and more in the logistics space, about $400 million a year in logistics. We do a little bit of everything, so we have an intermodal division, freight forwarding, customs brokerage. We like to think of ourselves, and what I'm trying to push our organization to is to be mode neutral. That's important as it relates to the presentation. This will be truck-centric, but I think that's really where people are feeling the most pain, but I'm very comfortable with us talking about a variety of subjects. Let's start, though, with the economy. And real quickly, from an economic perspective, it's a big part of, quote-unquote, the problem that we're in right now from a capacity side. Because we're going to talk a lot about how we got capacity constrained, but a big part is good news. It's that the economy is starting to pick up. We're seeing economic lift. And whether you believe in those that think it's that 2% or the higher end of the range at 3%, in either case, what we're starting to see is signs of kind of ongoing systemic rebuilding of the economy. Obviously, that translates to freight. And whether you're looking at the job change growth or what's happening with unemployment rate when we're sitting in a world of full employment at a time when there's a driver shortage, if you have an economy that's lifting, and jobs are tight, and you're in an industry that's difficult to attract new entrants, it makes for a pretty toxic mix. When we think about freight, or when I think about freight, there's really 3.5, in my view, buckets that really, really define freight. You've got personal consumption, you've got manufacturing, you have housing starts, and the half bucket is where do we sit in inventory. So I want to talk a little bit about that. From a consumption growth perspective, we're starting to see the consumer come back into the game. We're seeing people start to engage more, starting to feel a little more confident. 401ks are up a little bit. They have a little more personal wealth. They have a little more comfort and line of sight to what they believe to be a regulatory environment where economic growth and activity and business friendly policies are going to be in place. And it puts them back in the game. And the consumer is a big part of what's been out of the economy for the last several years. You pair that with housing, and you think about the housing bubble we had back in 07, 08, and you think about where we're at today, and you see single-family dwelling, single-family housing starts really starting to take off. And there's a ton of freight that goes into every house, every rooftop that's built, and there's all kinds of estimates between 8 and 13 truckloads per house of freight that it takes to build a house in America. And so single-family starts are an important indicator of what's happening. Now, you see a little bit of a decline in multifamily dwellings, and that's really an indication of the fact that people migrated to multifamily during the recession, not out of desire, not out of some big cultural shift. We all tried to talk about it, and you could see media types talking all the time about it was a big cultural landscape shift in our country, and people were going to start to live more in those type of environments. And I, for one, from the beginning, was a bit of a naysayer on that philosophy because I just thought, people do what they have to do in tough times to make sure that they can still provide for a holistic view of their family. And if that means living in an apartment, that's what they'll do. As they start to have a little disposable income as soon as they can, nobody wants the neighbor with the noise next door if they can avoid it, and they'll start to migrate and move back into single-family housing. And so we're seeing housing starts take off and really consistently start to gain some steam as multifamily new starts have really tapered off. Factories, at the same time, are really starting to ramp up their output. So you see factory outputs and confidence in manufacturing and manufacturing output across the scale and scope of different outputs increasing. So that's also an indicator and a driver of freight. And all of that is then balanced against probably the most important thing, that half bucket, if you will, but it's the lever. You take these 3 buckets and you ask yourself how much freight does it produce, but you have to put the backdrop of our inventories bloated or not. And there was a time when when we were coming through an already difficult freight experience, we also had bloated inventories as a supply chain. And so as people drew those inventories down, there was a doubling down effect on how many trucks were out there versus how much freight, and what ultimately translated to a very loose capacity environment. That was going to be short-lived. All we had to do is sit at a table and kind of reasonably look at what was happening with inventories, and one could tell and predict that this too will stop and this cycle will turn, and here we are. And so now, is the reason the green bar on this graph is important is that's our belief, my belief, that that's about the optimal range for inventories. And the point being, we're in that range. So we're not suddenly below inventory levels and we have some big ramp up needed, but nor are we bloated. So now those first three buckets define whether or not we're going to be in a strong freight environment or not. So if you have a rising consumer confidence, if you have rising economic activity, rising manufacturing output, and wages are starting to climb again, freight will follow and freight will be there from a demand perspective as long as inventories are not bloated, and they are not at this point. So if you take that from an economic overview down into a freight overview, what you see is both raw shipment levels are up. Obviously, expenditures are up because people are spending more per load than they did just a very short time ago, because as capacity tightens, people are asking to be paid a higher rate to justify the negligent investment or underinvestment that they did in their fleets during the time of recession because they couldn't afford to, and that is causing the economic impact to be even greater than the number of shipments. At the same time, imports are up, so we see import volumes climbing. So we are still a large trading partner with all of the countries that we do business with. So it's not just a domestic phenomenon that we're going through. And then the bottom right just shows that, and along the way, we've seen a little shift in those patterns. So we've seen East Coast port activity increase at a slightly greater rate than overall import activity as the Panama Canal comes online, and as you start to see retailers diversifying their risk away from just a West Coast strategy, as they've been through a couple of labor problems that have probably taught them some valuable lessons, and now they're looking to better diversify and spread out that risk as they look forward into their supply chain design. Back to the consumer. So what does it do? As you start to have this self-fulfilling prophecy, you start to see consumer confidence just in general. The general will of the consumer to go out, partake in the economy, take risks, and actually start to reactivate the purchasing that drives one of the central legs of this freight stool, and the consumer's doing that. So whether you look at the Consumer Confidence Index or the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, you see this trend of growing optimism. And we may be a country divided in many ways right now about a number of issues, but the fact of the matter is people across a broad spectrum of economic backgrounds have more money this year than they had a year ago, and they're spending it. They're willing to go out and participate in the economy. That leads again to another view of the same data, but manufacturers are ramping up. There's starting to be pride in building things in America. And so you see this activity leading to more domestic output, followed by ultimately selling at the retail level. Retail sales are up. You know, we are 51% retail in our business, so we're very, very heavily retail at Werner. And so we track this very closely, both year over year same-store sales growth, but sales versus inventory levels by store and then by vertical. And in almost every case, unless it's a struggling retailer, and there's certainly a few of those out there, if you separate anybody that's doing average or better, they are doing it with leaner inventory levels with better than average same-store sales compared to recent years. So why do we have a problem? Why don't we just go out and ramp up for this, get the trucks, and haul the freight? It comes down to a very simple, often overused term, but one that is very relevant today, and that's the driver shortage. It's never been more difficult. I've been doing this since 1991. I've never seen a market like the market we're in today, trying to go out and hire, attract, train, and retain quality drivers. And the key word here is quality drivers, because there are driver applicants out there. Just an anecdotal story, but at Werner last year, we received 113,000 applications. So clearly, there are people out there. Out of that group, we were able to hire and actually met our criteria and met our standards roughly 3%. So the washout rate and the people that don't even get past the first round is over 70% before you even do an interview or even speak to them, because of the background of that individual driver. And that could be anything from drug and alcohol to prior convictions to motor vehicle violations, and the list goes on and on. It's getting increasingly difficult in the litigious world we work in to hire a driver that you can safely put on the road and have confidence in delivering your freight. And so everybody says, well, it's real simple. Just stop the turnover. You know, we just need to hold on to the drivers. So I wanted to put this in here. This is probably the piece that I think is most overlooked. What is the single biggest obstacle over the next several years to being at full employment in terms of trucks being seated across America? It's retirements. And unless one of us can figure out how to turn back the clock, the hands of time, so to speak, we're not going to fix that. The United States trucking industry's average demographic is about 10 years older than the demographic for like jobs across America, whether that's construction or manufacturing jobs of similar skills. The U.S. truck driver is on average 10 years older. So there's this huge baby boomer population still driving. They do phenomenal work. Arguably, they're some of the best drivers out there, and they are all at or nearing retirement. So we have this big bubble coming through right now of retirements, followed by a lower than ever entrant pool of new entrants. And the new entrants, it's not just pay. Now, we need to raise pay as an industry, and we're out there at Werner. We've raised pay 17% in the last 2 years, and we have $22 million of pay designed into our 2018 plan for our driver force. I don't know that it's enough. I don't know that you can pay enough to get people today that are out there thinking about options when you have unemployment levels that we saw earlier that are at full employment and safety nets and other mechanisms that are well intended but often overutilized. It's more difficult than ever to get somebody kind of into a new industry, especially if they have to spend money to do it. The average truck driver spends somewhere around $5,000 to $7,000 to go to truck driving academies. After that, that generally is always repaid by their employer, but the point is they have to front that money first. That person is going to take a job that's going to pay them first year into the industry at $50,000 without a college education, and within 2 years, on average, they're going to make mid-60s. That's good money, given the educational requirements and everything else, until you tell them, you're going to get in this truck, you're going to drive this truck, be over the road, you're going to get home once every week, once every other week, and live a lifestyle away from your family. That is not of interest to today's young people as they come into the workforce. We have to build a better job. So when you think about surviving in this transportation environment, one of the things is how much can we collaborate? And there's nothing we can do that would be too much to try to make their lives better. Because when I think about keeping drivers and retaining drivers, it's about how much do you pay them, what kind of lifestyle do you give them, and what kind of equipment are they able to drive. And if you don't have all three of those right, you won't keep them. We've been focusing heavily as an industry and at Werner on all of those things. It's paid off in our organization. We were at 19-year lowest turnover in the fourth quarter. We just released earnings today at 3, by the way. And so it was 19-year low turnover. So it can be done, but it's expensive and it takes a ton of collaboration with your shipping partners. So when carriers come to you talking about loading delays and unloading delays, issues at a dock, or even treatment issues, they have to be taken seriously. Because one of the things that happens all the time when I interact with sales is they'll bring an opportunity to us and they'll say, listen, this freight isn't real pretty, but they pay a premium and there's going to be loading issues, there's going to be delays at consignee, they can't do anything about it, these are the facilities they have, they were built 30 years ago, this is as good as it gets. And unless that premium is $7,000, the math doesn't work. Because if I send somebody in there and we burn through drivers to load that one load and they quit over the exhausting experience of that day, I cannot afford to do that. These are not disposable assets. These assets are that hard to come by. So more and more people are waking up to a reality where they have in their network pain points. Nobody has a bad network to speak of, but everybody has pain points, and it's all about the seriousness by which they decide to address it. Going into the ELD change December 18th, I talked to a lot of our shippers, and I would say, how many of your carriers are non-ELD compliant? And the general response would be, well, I have 10% or I have 15% of my loads hauled by non-ELD compliant carriers, so I think I'm okay, because if those 15% of my loads have this 3 to 5% capacity reduction and that price gets affected, I'll deal with it. And I said, that's not your problem. That's not the right question. The question is, in my view, Go deeper, look at the lane level, and what you find in almost every case is they may have 15% of their freight with non-ELD carriers, but it was 90% of one lane or 100% of 3 lanes. And that's where the problem is. That the market finds, and water finds its easiest path, the market will find its match. And those non-ELD carriers found themselves in those lanes because people with electronic logs couldn't. They couldn't participate in those lanes. And it's not what people think. It's not the transit time. That may or may not be a factor in some cases, but usually it was about delays. It was about unnecessary delays at shippers or consignees that simply would cause carriers like Werner's and others to forfeit the right to participate because we could not put our driver in that environment. Followed, if you think about this retirement issue and some of the issues we're talking about, is industry growth following retirements. If we're going to grow, if we're going to get out of this capacity issue, and if we're going to have an opportunity to add new entrants, there's going to be industry growth, and to do that, we need a tremendous amount of drivers. The turnover thing has to be addressed. We have to retain them, but make no mistake, if turnover goes from 70% to 50%, you don't suddenly create tens of thousands of new drivers, because that turnover was a carousel. They left company A to go to company B, left company B to go to company C. It's the same group of drivers that jump. We call them jumpers, and when we're looking at applicants, if somebody is a jumper, we simply don't hire them. Because if they jumped before, they'll jump again, and there's nothing we're going to do. We won't have enough time with that individual to get them to understand the culture and our deep-seated commitment to drivers that we have to be able to retain them. They will continue to jump. The only way we're going to make this whole thing better is to eliminate the inherent obstacles to the job itself, which is getting them home more often, giving them a better lifestyle, and treating them with more respect. So how'd that play out at the fleet level? So we talked economy, then we talked about the biggest obstacle, which is drivers, but at the fleet level, this is something that gets grossly overlooked in my view. So if you go back a couple of years, back to 2015, you'll see that the large carriers kind of hit a wall and couldn't grow anymore and actually went backwards a little bit in 15. But that was more than made up for back then by small carrier growth. So carriers less than $30 million of revenue were able to still keep growing and adding capacity and keep everybody kind of whole. Then you get into 16, and the large carriers were now in a full, retreat mode, not because they wanted to, but because the ability to attract and retain drivers was that much harder. They were all ELD by then, by and large. They were all operating fully legal under the new known to be coming rules, and it was causing the ability to attract and retain drivers to be more difficult, and you saw fleet contraction. The fact that the freight rates were not reinvestable and they didn't justify reinvestment was the other reason. They couldn't put the money back in their fleet because there wasn't enough money to justify doing that. But again, in 16, you saw small carriers growing and filling that void. Now you get to 17. It's another repeat story. In 2017, large carriers once again shrank. Only difference is small carriers hit that same wall. Now they couldn't grow. They couldn't add capacity, especially in advance of ELDs. They were changing their operation, rethinking how they were going to dispatch. They were having to do things differently. And frankly, the driver pool itself just got that much tighter. And so for the first time, you saw a true net reduction since the very significant reduction that happened back in 07, 08. And so as at the very time the economy's starting to lift, the consumer's coming back into the game, housing starts are starting to take off, total industry capacity was down. What's another hidden cost? What the other things that I think people just completely overlook, because we get asked all the time, well, why don't you just go buy more trucks? Well, it's really difficult to buy more trucks when the truck you have you can't get rid of. And we can't afford to keep running the trucks we have because you can't attract the driver. So if you take a company like Werner, once upon a time, just a few years ago, we were 2.7 average years of age in our truck fleet. Today, as we sit here, we're 1.9. We had to get our age of fleet down to attract the very kind of drivers we're talking about. In order to do that, we had to sell a tremendously larger than normal amount of used trucks into a market where there really were no buyers. The freight rates weren't justifying reinvestment by the traditional secondary buyer, which is your owner-operator market and your small fleet market buying from larger, better capitalized carriers once their truck had gotten to 4 years old, 5 years old. So we had ended up with a glut of used trucks. We're still working through that as an industry. So despite the fact that we have a driver shortage, there's a whole lot of trucks out there idle right now. They're all used and they're all parked and they're all for sale. And the question is, who's going to buy them? Now, luckily, if you look across this, I know there's a ton of graphs up here, I apologize, but if you start to look across the top line, you'll start to see used trucks are starting to pick up. Now people are getting back in that game, and they're starting to buy trucks at a more rapid clip. Obviously, the net effect of that is it's bringing down used truck inventory, but it's still bloated. So the price of used truck is still terrible. Not too long ago, a used truck, when you sold it, would pay for 3/4 of your new truck. Today, it'll pay for well under half of your new truck every time you're selling one. It's a very difficult proposition if you can't find a buyer and you can't find a way to move that equipment. What could change and tighten this used truck market and get that back to a place where you can actually move some of this equipment is the bottom left graph. New truck activity is rising, but the middle graph will show we're booked out now as an industry all the way to July. So right now, if a person said, okay, I met with my customer, I feel confident, we together are going to collaborate and I'm going to grow, if they order a truck, they're not getting a slot until July. That's going to push further in the not too distant future, and I think by the time this thing updates, you'll start to see 7-8 month type lead times. So if you can't buy a new truck, the only way to grow then is to go into that used market and start to kind of gobble up the rest of that excess inventory. So I think there is some signs of life for used truck values out there, but we're still at least a quarter, maybe 2 quarters away from them being reasonable. And this matters whether you're in rail, whether you're a shipper, or anywhere else, because until this gets fixed and this glut gets kind of digested, you won't see a healthy, robust trucking capacity out there. And so all things are, all bets are off. And that's why modal shifts are happening. That's why there's a lot of friction at the dock with loads being rolled, because we have to work through this glut of used truck inventory. Which leads us to this. So in January, the 2 dots on the graph here that talk about where we're at from a demand environment clearly show that demand is higher than it's been, even, and it's important to look at, even during peak in 14. So we're sitting in a demand environment today, and this is true at our organization as well, that's as robust as anything we've seen during peak, even in traditional years. It's remarkable to walk in. Most truckers use the same kind of metric, some version of pre-book percentage. But when you walk into a trucking operation, a very healthy network would be coming in at 6 a.m. and seeing 115% booked, meaning you have 15% more loads than you have truck and you haven't even made a call yet. That's where you would need to be to then book up even further, to tighten your network even further, and several trucks across the network will do more than one load in a day. Today, in January, a normal in January would be 80%. Today in January, all over America, truckers are walking in to 125, 130, 135% type pre-book levels, and they haven't made a call yet. They haven't made an outbound customer service solicitation call. When you're there, it's no longer healthy. When you're there, something is going to get rolled. And the question is, how do you manage through it? Whose freight do you pick up? How strong are the commitments? What does that negotiation look like? What are the arrangements that have been made and the money in the bank, so to speak, so that when it's time to money to come out of the bank, and I don't mean rates, I mean credibility, integrity, character of the relationship, that's what defines how freight gets picked up and moved in America. A little different graph. So on the far right, you see what it looked like January a year ago, dark red being a hot zone or a heat map. You look at the middle top, the whole country. The whole country. Here we are, December to January 6th, and the whole country is basically beet red. You look at it from a temperature control perspective, same concept, different color. It goes from this sort of spattering of different scenarios to the entire country being deep blue in terms of being oversold. The temperature controlled environment's a little more pronounced because that's where, unfortunately, driver delays at shipper and at consignee, whether it was in the field or at a dock, were always kind of the most egregious. And as a result, that's where the most pain's being felt. We have to do this stuff legal. We have to honor this. And the thing I like to remind people is there's a lot of rhetoric out there blaming it on ELDs. Well, if we just didn't do that stupid ELD rule, with or without ELDs, there was a human being sitting around all those hours before, having their time wasted all those hours before, making them unproductive all those hours before. And with ELDs, we're able to honor and respect and give the respect to each of those hours that it deserves. So it leads, in my view at least, to a conversation about modal conversion and mode opportunities. And clearly, I talked earlier about being mode neutral. I think any partner worth their salt has to go into their shippers every day and be mode neutral. If there's an opportunity for something to go rail that's going truck today, if we're not advocating for it, somebody else will. So we better be the voice in their ear bringing it up, in good times or in bad. If we're not doing that, we're not doing our job. If any supplier isn't doing that, they're not doing theirs. But the issue is scale. You still have a fundamental scale issue that has to be understood. So if you look at where we're at today, with truck being the absolute predominance of the way freight is moved across America in terms of tonnage, and you project out to 2028 and you look out may look, if we could really execute on this modal conversion, it really doesn't change much. And the reason is every time you open new geographies and new markets and people move and you have migration of where the population is at, the quickest, easiest, short-term, usually 5, 10, 15-year term to get that freight there is going to be by truck until infrastructure catches up to do it by other modes. Even though we're not at all oblivious to the reality that these other modes are all going to grow faster. Every one of these other modes will grow faster. I mean, you look at pipeline, especially with the regulatory burdens that have been lifted and the ability to move things by pipeline that just a few years ago would have been, unthinkable. Now there is projected growth of really astronomical type proportions if it all goes through. Rail intermodal clearly has a future. We're bullish on what that looks like. We believe there's still freight out there that can and should be converted, but it isn't like rail capacity is just laying around fallow waiting for something to do. The rails are pretty robust and they're pretty full too. And so it's going to be an interesting problem to navigate. But truck will still continue to grow while losing share. It'll grow in terms of total tonnage hauled. And so we have to build mutually a future that makes that happen, which goes back to good lifestyle, good pay, and a good piece of equipment. The backdrop against all of that is some of the things that just topical things. You got regulations and regulatory reform. So our industry is kind of unique. All over America, I haven't checked his math, and I don't want to be into the fake news game one way or the other, but Trump talked recently about 22-1. Every regulation that they implemented, they've now killed 22. Now, I have no idea if that's true. What I do know is in this particular industry, there hasn't been a lot of regulation rollback. We've seen actually regulations coming in my view, some of which are needed and necessary. The ELD rule was a necessary thing. If we were ever going to get to a level playing field where every hour mattered and every hour counted the same and every driver and every human being out there's time was considered equally, to do it, you had to have electronic logs. More importantly, you had to have electronic logs if we're ever going to fight and make a credible argument to fix hours of service. Most of the issues with ELDs are not even ELD issues, they're hours of service issues. We have opportunities to make improvements there, but we needed a set of data and standard playing field to be able to aggregate all of that data into a credible argument. ELDs will give us the opportunity to do it. You've got things like F4A. You've probably heard that acronym, or maybe you haven't, but 1994, the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act, what that was, very simply stated, was it was passed and legislated to say, if you're in interstate commerce, and that's your job, that's your employment, then you can't have states or municipalities overrule or intervene in how you're paid. Pretty clear cut. Clearly, if you're in the supply chain business, you're in interstate commerce. That's what we do for a living. But what we've seen is state after state, starting in California, not surprisingly, but starting in California, start to put their state labor rules and wage rules in effect over the top of federal rules on how people are paid. And here's the greatest irony. In most cases, the very people, quote unquote, benefiting from this, hate it. So we saw a significant increase in turnover in California when we converted all of our pay packages to California regs, because it's a very, very convoluted, difficult to understand way to be paid. They don't make any more money. They have to just be paid by the way the law reads. And they were all well over any minimum wage law, even including in California's own. But the problem was it didn't comply. Well, F4A clearly is a regulation that needs to be enforced. It's something that we need legislatively to fix again and restate, because the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld that it's okay. So today in trucking and in other industries, you could have a person paid legally, federally, by their contract with the company of employment, cross over into California and by the very nature of crossing the border, be out of compliance with federal law while being in compliance with state law, or vice versa. That's untenable. Now you take it a step further and you've got San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other municipalities passing yet another set of laws and rules, all of which are just inhibiting the ability to attract and retain drivers in this industry. If that's not daunting and concerning enough, we have all this talk about NAFTA. Anybody who knows me knows, they mentioned in my bio, I lived and worked in Mexico for many years. Mexico is very near and dear to my heart, and all this talk about NAFTA is troubling to me. We do $1 million a minute between our countries. $1 million a minute of trade with our countries, every minute. Yet we're out there talking about tearing the house down. It may need to be remodeled. I was in Mexico City in 1993 when NAFTA was being negotiated. I was there when it went into effect, and I was on the other side, by the way, running a Mexican trucking company. So I've got deep-seated views on both sides of this issue. We have to revamp it, we have to improve it. There are things that can get better, and it is a 20-plus-year-old agreement, so there's no shame in saying, let's relook at it. But it cannot, and we cannot allow it to be a tear down. It needs to be a remodel, and we need to stick to that, and we have to have a do-no-harm approach if we're really interested in American jobs and the future of our economy. ELDs I've already talked about. I think they're here to stay. They need to be here to have a playing field that makes sense for all participants. And then lastly, our decrepit infrastructure. I'm a believer in the fact that there is no reason, no matter where you sit on government spending, I have a hard time believing anybody wouldn't invest in their plumbing. You may be the thriftiest person in your neighborhood, but if your pipes are broken, I suspect you're going to fix them. If your roof is leaking, you know that if you don't spend the money to fix it, you're about to have a whole lot of other stuff that you're going to be spending money on soon enough because it's going to get damaged. And that's where we're at. The average motorist suffers $1,600 a year between congestion and physical damage to their motoring vehicle due to today's infrastructure. It has to be addressed. The only way to address it, it's going to take significant dollars. The only way to do that is to raise them. And in our view, my view, the only way to do that is the fuel tax because it's clearly the most efficient way. I'm real simple. If I want to raise $1 and I know that less than 0.2 of 1 penny goes to the administration of it, which is what it is in fuel tax, and my next closest alternative spends 21% or 21 cents of every dollar to administer, that alone to me says we got to deal with electric, we got to deal with alternative fuels, but while we figure that out, collect a fuel tax in the meantime versus giving 20% away to administering some convoluted or more complicated approach. And then lastly, what's the good news on the truck side? There's some really good news. The advanced collision mitigation systems are working. The drivers' lives are becoming safer. The data-driven approach to post-accident investigations is better than it's ever been. We've all known as an industry for a long, long time that over 73% of all crashes were caused by the other vehicle. I guarantee as this data continues to come forth and more people have forward-looking facing cameras, more people have collision mitigation, more people essentially have a black box on their truck, we will find that's the most understated number in this industry. It will be far in excess of 73% as this data comes home to roost. And we're seeing that in our fleet with forward-facing cameras every day. And the technology works. Lastly, and then we'll turn it over to questions, lots of questions always on, isn't autonomous going to fix this? Not in the short term. I mean, driver assist technology to make that life better is real. Full autonomous vehicles going down the road and delivering freight point to point with no driver touching it anywhere in the process is not real. We're 5, 10, 15 years away from level 4 automation, in my view, with the driver still in the cab, and level 5 is even further out than that. The reality is, even when we get there and we start to introduce this technology into the industry, it will obviously start in long stretches of road or short confined private yards. So autonomous at rail hubs, autonomous in long stretches, perhaps, but the driver and a human being still need to be involved in that. And it's really the convergence of multiple factors. It's legislative, it's perception, and some of it is reality. There are not markings today at the average shipper or receiver that would function well at all in an autonomous environment. Our drivers have to look at signs every day saying right turn only, knowing that the dock is on the left side. That's unfortunate. That's a reality of the world they live in. Planes have been able to take off and land for 20 years without a pilot. Nobody got here that way. Nobody in this room got here that way. And lastly on that, one thing I think is overlooked, the average truck driver on the average load in America every day takes into their hands 2.5 times the lives that a 777 pilot would in the back of his plane because of the amount of motoring vehicles that they pass through the course of doing their job. I don't see us turning that over to a computer-only scenario in the near future. We obviously are staying very close to all that technology, and we are fully embracing the quest to get there, because I think from that quest comes technology that will make a difference and will make life better and will make that job much more tenable for many, many more people. With that, we'll turn it over to Q&A.
Okay, have a seat. And first of all, Paul Page at the Wall Street Journal has been writing a lot of articles, his staff, about what's going on with the capacity crisis. One of the ones you and I beforehand talked about this, where you've got basically CEOs now on quarterly calls with analysts citing reduced profitability because of increased freight cost, and some of them holding back, instructing their people to hold back shipments until this freight crisis passes. Does this thing go on for the remainder of 2018 and on into 2019, or 3 months, 4 months from now, we'll all be breathing a sigh of relief and finding trucks that we need?
Yeah, I don't think, if you think about where we're at today in January, the graph that I put up with freight demand in January, and you think about ELD enforcement doesn't go into effect till April 1st, you put the backdrop of the demographic issue in there, and you see any kind of economic lift, and frankly, I think 2 to 3% is probably going to end up on the low side. I think you'll be high 2 to low 3 versus anywhere near low 2% GDP growth. You put all that in a blender, and I don't see any way capacity loosens anytime this year. And I think you look out into 19, and that's really when the retirement bubble starts hitting everybody even harder. So I think for the next couple of years at least, it's going to be a tight environment. It's all about the relationship you have between carrier and shipper. Like I tell folks all the time, we have 1,470 or so shippers that we do more than one load a week with. That number may have to be less than that in order to grow with those shippers that you have relationships with that demand and have earned that growth.
Okay.
And it's a tough spot to be in, but that's just the reality we're in.
So we're looking at tight capacity through 2018 on into 2019. Your assessment?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things, Derek was involved in a webinar we called it The Perfect Storm in November. And one of the things you opened my eyes to was the issue of ELDs. And I know that a lot of folks were expecting a reduction in capacity because of truckers leaving the market. But one of the things you highlighted was the fact that it's not just truckers leaving the market, it's truckers running differently because of ELDs. And maybe you could share with the audience things like the parking, where you see a driver that has 2 or 3 hours left, they're pulling over because they're not seeing parking 2 hours out.
Yeah, so I think the theme there is this. The easiest and most talked about part about ELDs, I think, is the least significant part, which is transit time. People weren't running hot, so to speak, and taking, well, let me rephrase that. Of course they were, but that's not the large percentage of the issue. Of course, some driver out there was still doing way more miles and overnight than he should have. But that was not the crux of my concern. My concern has always been the underestimation of shipper and consignee dwells, and the least understood part of all is with electronic logs, when you're out of hours, which means parking and planning to park becomes paramount to scheduling your day. So the idea of skipping over an available parking spot, knowing the next one is 2 hours away and you have 2 hours and 15 minutes to move, is much more precarious in an electronic logging environment. And so you see drivers shutting down earlier and earlier, and truck stops finding themselves more and more full. And it's a real problem. I mean, part of the infrastructure investment of this country has to be, we have to address commercial parking. It can't just be done at the truck stop level. If it is only done at the truck stop level, it's going to become expensive. There will be charges coming soon, because we can't afford for trucks to, in an already constrained environment, to be shutting down 2 hours early or 3 hours early, nor does that driver want to shut down early, but parking is paramount and you have to do it legally. And so drive by, just remember this today, as you're driving around next week, Take a look at 5 p.m. at any truck stop in America, and what you're going to find is a full parking lot. That was not the case 3 years ago. 8, 9 p.m. is when they filled up. And now Mike was telling a story that this Sunday in Chicago at 4 p.m. he saw one that was already filled up. That is not abnormal. The ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute, puts out a survey to American truck drivers every year. Parking shortage was number 2 this year on the entire survey for them. It's a big problem.
So when I add it all up, we're talking about capacity 2018, 2019. I add it all up, estimated loss of capacity from ELDs. I've heard numbers all over the board. As best you can, for internal planning purposes, if you can divulge this, what is Werner looking at for loss of overall capacity in the market? Not Werner, because you've been ELD compliant forever.
We have 18 billion miles on ELDs, and we converted over 20 years ago, and we were the first in the country to do it. So we came out early on this issue 3 years ago and said 3 to 5% industry-wide. 2 years ago, we stayed there. A year ago, we still said that number. I think that number now, as I look at it, is maybe understated, if anything. I've never been a believer that it's a 15% or 10% phenomenon. I do believe it's more real, and anybody who thought it was 0 to 1 or 2 just didn't understand what happens when you really measure. It's not the 2 logbook phenomenon that everybody thinks about from watching movies. It's simply logging at 55 miles an hour through Chicago, which probably hasn't happened in 55 years. And so you can't do that in real life when you're on electronic logs, and it chews that time up and that capacity up, and it doesn't take into account the advancement of any retirements that may have happened, because people who are near retirement, these are honorable men and women. The American truck drivers are some of the most honorable people out there in my view, and they don't just decide to quit. And so they need an impetus sometimes. There's a reason, and there was a group of drivers in our fleet as well that got to that ELD moment, and we were already ELD compliant, but it was like this jumping off point, which was interesting. But around the industry, that would be obviously much more pronounced if you're at a non-ELD carrier. And so we've lost some good drivers. They were going to retire and honestly wanted to retire anyway. But there is an effect beyond just the obvious transit time issue.
So let's go then flip over to the driver's side. One of the stories I shared with you, an associate within our company was sharing a story that she has a cousin that's a truck driver, working for a trucking company in the Chicagoland area. Mm-hmm. Since December 18th, they've lost 50% of their over-the-road drivers, people that just said that's it. Is that an aberration from your perspective? And this is a smaller carrier. She said the total number between 30 to 40 drivers have left. Do you see that as something that will affect smaller trucking companies as opposed to perhaps the larger, the big boys?
I mean, I think it's an aberration to the extent that I don't think there's huge populations of trucking companies that were running hot enough that converting to ELDs caused half their fleet to quit when they had to change their lifestyle. But I do think there's a whole lot of companies, even the best performing. So think about big, publicly traded companies that converted 5, 6, 7 years ago, or us 20 years ago. They were public before they converted, so they were trying to run as legal as they could every day. They could not afford a lawsuit. It's not worth hurting or getting hurt or hurting others. They were trying to do the right thing, and when they converted, they lost 3 to 7%. Now take that same thought process down to a small carrier that maybe, unbeknownst to the owner or the leadership, maybe not, was running significantly hotter than that. That impact at those fleets will be far greater. Luckily, the good stewards in this industry, the people that were trying to get ahead of this, we've known about this for years. They got way ahead of it, a year ago, 6 months ago. The folks that waited till December are getting caught with a reality that their drivers were running, and being asked to run is probably a better way of saying it. Nobody woke up and said, hey, I want to sit around at a shipper for 5 hours and then run straight through. But they were being asked to do it every day, and ELDs shines a light on that and causes us to figure out a way to make that more efficient.
Well, in talking with some other brokers, one of the things we've seen, and I think a lot of brokers have seen, is lanes which were formerly one-day lanes are now being converted into two-day lanes. Yeah. Probably talking to 15, 20 brokers, and TIA has done a great job of representing the brokers, and love to see a survey on this, but they're not going to take the chance of running illegal now.
Yeah, and so I think back to the toolkit concept, my advice there would be fair with the discussion. I mean, there's no doubt at all that there are lanes that were one-day lanes that are now two-day lanes, and therefore that price increase is not going to be 5% to make that work. So yes, there are going to be lanes out there that are going to see significant changes in fundamental economics. There are dedicated fleets that were 3 turns a week that are now 2 turns a week. There's going to be a significant economic change. At the same time, don't allow for, nor ask for, if you're on the other side of the desk, to apply that same math to lanes that were right before and they're right now. And so we've got to make it at a lane and specific data-driven approach. In aggregate, though, that's what's pushing. That's why you see the aggregate of rates in that 7, 8, 9% type going up, because some lanes are going up 40%, and it's real. There's also opportunistic people out there.
You just kind of glossed over something. Some lanes are going up 40%.
There are absolutely lanes out there that are going up 40%. Just OD pair, depending on characteristics, there is no doubt there are lanes that will be, that individual shippers at individual lane level will see that kind of rate change.
Okay, one other question on drivers, and then I've got a couple others, and then we'll throw it open to the audience here. You talk about the driver and the chronological issues, the age of the drivers, retirement. One of the things you did not mention, though, is if I see a boom in construction or in the aftermath of the hurricane, labor markets in the Southeast, or I was reading an article, the California wildfires, the demand for construction. Construction has always been, perceptually at least, one of the key competitors for truck drivers.
Yes.
Talk to me about the impact that you see going forward in a full employment environment, how that could potentially affect the driver population.
So that's a great question. I think the biggest prisoner's dilemma we have in transportation right now is we need an infrastructure bill. We have to get infrastructure funding for this country. And so the industry that needs it, by and large, is trucking. And we're asking to rebuild America's roads and bridges. If you get your wish, you just created your biggest competitor to that same very small labor pool. But we have to rebuild the infrastructure. So the answer is, that's why we're trying to get out in front of it from a wage perspective. We're trying to get out in front of it from a lifestyle perspective to make sure as those infrastructure jobs come, and they will, that it is not a clear-cut, easy decision as to why I want to leave my truck and swing a hammer. I want to make that choice really, really tough by making sure there's economic incentive and lifestyle equality. You're not going to have it's going to be hard to compete with going home every day and sleeping in your bed on a construction job after a day's work of construction, but we've got to get as close to that as we can. Okay,
but then you said Werner has increased pay by 17% over the last 2 years.
Correct.
Okay, assuming you're one of the largest, give me a forecast for how much. You mentioned you have $10 million more, I believe.
22.
How much more will a driver be paid over the next 2 years?
I think wages, are going to continue to go up in the industry. I think right now the smart participants in the market have made sure and put equal amount of attention on lifestyle and on equipment, because I think that is a huge, huge component and cannot be overstated. But wages still need to go up. I mean, in my opinion, my view, if you're going to be competitive and attract economically and pull away from infrastructure jobs and construction jobs and keep people in the seat, by its very nature, trucking jobs need to be paying $60,000, $70,000 for an experienced person and up. And we have jobs that do that today in our fleet. We have jobs that pay significantly more than that if it's specialized or dedicated type opportunity. But you can't attract new entrants into the market at industry wages in the 40s and think that we're going to be able to keep pace with the demand that we talked about today.
So what is a little bit surprising about that was, I think it was a little over a year ago, one of the nation's largest retailers was talking about trying to find drivers for their private fleet, and they were advertising a pay package that I believe was in the mid-70s. Okay, how do you compete against that kind of pay package?
Well, those jobs are extremely tough to compete with, period, because if those that operate private fleets, and I'm sure some in the room maybe do, they generally are getting first pick of the freight. They're optimizing all of those trucks before they take everything else and put it out to bid. Those lifestyles are better, and that pay has always been at a premium. But I think the rest of the industry is finally catching up to it. And so we've got to pay like wages if we're going to try to attract similar talent. And we've got to get folks home through our own engineering of disparate people's freight and use multiple different customers' freight to get drivers home more often. The other thing that happens right now is in our four walls is we talk all the time about, it used to be you'd find the customer and find the freight and then hire the drivers to fill it. And now we find the drivers and where we have success and find the freight in that area, which means there is freight out there where we know we have no ability or no confidence that we're going to be able to gain traction or gain driver numbers, that we simply can't pursue that freight the same way as we used to.
Okay, and that brings me to the topic of collaboration. Yeah, I think you mentioned that by my count 5 times. Big deal for Werner.
Real big deal, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about, it's a contention of mine that a lot of shippers may know what happens when a truck pulls up to their dock, but they have no idea what's going on when a Werner driver pulls up to their customer's dock. Walk me through that process, and let's say it's not going the way you want. You're not going to tolerate working conditions for your driver. You're not going to run the risk. Walk me through the process that a Werner might go through to alert a good customer that you've got some of their customers that you're not going to be pulling equipment to.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start with this. In general, I don't believe there's very many good customers and bad customers. There's customers with good lanes and customers with bad lanes, and all of you have them, or all shippers have them. And so that helps the conversation, because you're not going in saying somebody is a bad actor. You're just saying they have a bad segment or a bad location. And you have to be honest, and it has to be metric driven. I mean, we're in a time right now where there's a lot of alarmism going on. I'm not intending to do that, and hopefully if I am, I apologize. I'm saying have it be data driven, have it be metric driven, make sure people are able to validate their assumptions. You know, they owe it to you, we owe it to you to come in with thoughtful, well planned out obstacles to success, as well as solutions to make it better. That's what our customers deserve. What doesn't work is when you're met with, that's just the way it is. Because if that's the case, that's okay, that's an acceptable answer. But trucks have wheels, and they'll move elsewhere. And because you have no choice but to do that. You can't burn through drivers by putting them into environments that will make them unsuccessful or make the organization unsuccessful. Most shippers get that. Most shippers are working diligently. Best-in-class shippers, which we do customer scorecards, so we sit with our shippers and walk through scorecards and walk through areas for improvement, just like they do with us. And if we're truly being collaborative, that should be okay. And it should be, as long as everybody's willing to admit where we can improve, it works. If you have one side or the other closed off to that improvement, it doesn't. And then that's like any other relationship, you move on.
Okay, so just idea-wise, can you, I mean, I don't know if this is something that you feel comfortable disclosing. In a typical year, is there a percentage of customers that Werner will say our trucks have moved elsewhere?
I will solve differently. I will, just to be fair to the customers, that's a mutual decision sometimes. So I will tell you this, we look at our portfolio every year and assume going into January 1st that 10% of that portfolio will turn over. This year, we believe that number will be greater. So this year, for 2 reasons. One, there's more of an impetus to have to do so you can collaborate and collapse around those customers that you need to and have committed to. And to do that, if I can't grow trucks, you have to move something out of the network to create room, to create cap space, so to speak, for those that you're really growing with.
Okay, so that leads me to my, just got a couple more and want to throw it open to the audience. You and I were together at Denver for their Denver University's capstone logistics thing. You brought up something and I walked away going, wow. Talked to other truckers, Celadon was there, Tom Albrecht, and they were talking about they do 6,200 loads a week, and they're turning down 800 to 1,200 loads a day in January. I think the statistic that you guys mentioned, you're operating right now, before you turn the key, at 145% of capacity in January. Walk me through, you know, we're talking about a survival kit here, and I'm wondering what's going to happen with shippers in March, April, and May when that 145 goes to, you know, 165. I mean, in 2014, the height of the truck stop MDI was like 27. For the last 4 weeks, it's been above 40. You peaked at, I think March was 145 in 2014. You're there in January. What happens when it gets to 165, 170? What do you do?
You don't haul all the freight, I mean, for starters. I mean, right now, we don't track, well, we have the data. I don't speak to the data much around number of loads turned down per day, because I look at it like, if we're turning down those loads day of, then we have done something wrong day prior. So we need to be collaborating better than that. And so there's no badge of honor with how many loads I can turn down in a day. We don't want to do that if we can avoid it. Today, by the way, we're not saying 145. We've hit 145 in January, which is absolutely something we've never seen. But we're probably 125 to 135, which is remarkably high for January.
We're in January, though.
For January. And so part of the process every day is to sit, and we literally sit every Monday morning, including this Monday morning. You know, I sit with my executive team, and we have sales and ops and everybody in the room. And if you're trying to make service paramount, which we are, and last year we raised our service standards by 2.5 points, I believe that there's an opportunity to do more. The only way to do that is to cull excess freight out of the network. If you can't grow,
Can you repeat that?
is to cull excess freight out of the network. You got to get the white noise out so you can collapse around those customers that you truly have a collaborative, longer-term relationship with. That's not a pleasant thing, but it would be unfair in the literal sense of the word to try to keep everybody on board. You know, when you're filling a life raft, there's only so many places. If you load everybody in there, then they all die too. So you take what you can take and you move forward. And those are the tough trade-offs and decisions that we have to make every day. I would say this, though, the relationships and the conversations with shippers, they get it. People get it. I mean, people are trying to work through this. I think the real difficulty is, I'll give two quick stories. The shipper community that just changes the seats kind of on the Titanic, so they put a whole new staff in whenever it's a tight market and say, hey, it's new, we have a new philosophy, we have a new approach. I think that's a very shallow move. I mean, that's a bad move. The read-through on that is obvious for anybody on our side of the desk. It doesn't work. I mean, it's still the same company. We do business with companies. You know, that company is still the same company. So that is not an effective one. But the person who's been working diligently throughout the year, knowing that capacity was going to be tight, and now we're still in a pinch, we're going to bend over backwards and do everything we possibly can. The other thing is, we're probably, as an industry, let's say you lose in 3 to 5 for ELDs, let's say you saw shrinkage of 5% with large truckload and flat for small, there's 5% efficiency out there in the supply chain at docks all over America. So this is solvable, and it's in the hands of the folks that control those docks. There is absolutely 5% efficiency gains to be had.
So things like detention, things like...
All that. That's right. And so getting serious about addressing it will draw people to that freight in a hurry. Because in a world of choices, people want to have the cleanest possible freight they can get.
So for that customer that's not a Werner customer yet, but really needs Werner capacity right now, what advice would you give to these, where's the survival kit, what advice would you give them to increase their chances of getting Werner assets in 2018?
So whether it's Werner or someone else, because I don't want to make it a big thing just about Werner, but if I'm trying to enter into somebody's network today, enter with an amount of freight that makes it meaningful. I mean, that really matters. Size matters. I mean, if somebody's going to start with a new carrier, don't do the traditional step of, I'm going to put you on one lane and I'm going to test your service, and if your service is good, I'm going to look to do more, because I'll just shorten that outcome for you. The service is going to be terrible. You're not going to grow, and you just wasted both of your parties' time. I mean,
How do you really feel about it?
Well, because nobody right now in this market is going to be able to add one lane or one ship point in and do very well at it. I mean, that's just not going to work. So have a meaningful test of a meaningful amount of freight with that carrier and hold them accountable for the service that you expect. And they need to be willing to sign up for the same.
Okay, well, we've got a couple minutes. Any questions from the audience there? Yeah,
Sure.
Go ahead. Can you go to the... You got to get that.
Oh, that's right. They gave us
Wait.
Hold on, you're
We've
going to
got
be
a
the first
special
participant.
toy. Are you ready for this?
We're going to test your coordination.
Wait, you're going to love this.
Step in front of the mic. I've never done this, but they asked me to do this today. Don't drop that.
Now just
That's
turn
your
it
microphone.
upside,
It's a
and you
microphone.
can speak into the mic.
No, that's your microphone, the
That's
box.
the mic. The box is your
This
mic.
is the mic?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
live.
Oh, fantastic.
Try it.
Perfect. Does this work? Good, I'll sit here.
I tell you, NITL, we are all about technology. I'm telling you that right
Right.
now, baby. We are all about technology.
This will go viral at some point. So quick question. What do you expect the M&A sort of environment over the next couple of years? Is it big carriers buying small guys? Is there room for bigger ones to merge? How do you see that the next?
So I think
next few years?
activity is going to be high in terms of volume of transactions available to be had. The question becomes, so if you're a carrier looking at as another carrier today, and the data that you're examining is all non-ELD, it's really not worth the paper it's written on, in my view, because historical performance means nothing about what future is going to look like, and it's very difficult to ascertain what that carrier's routes, rates, and services really look like in an ELD compliant era. And unfortunately, not all, but many of those for sale today are recently converted ELD carriers, and so it's difficult to make much sense of any of that data. I think larger, more meaningful mergers and consolidation, like we've seen some of, could continue to play out in this industry, but it's still fragmented. I mean, even with some of the consolidation in recent times, you take the top 10 carriers in America and you're still 10% of the marketplace, all 10 combined. And so it's an ultra fragmented industry that even with significant consolidation will never wake up in a big 3 or big 5 or big 10 type scenario. It's just not, the underlying economics aren't set up for it. But I do think you'll see more acquisitions happen.
Great question. Other questions?
Yes.
Throw the box. It's really light. I'll tell you what.
It doesn't hurt if it hits
Watch
you.
it. Trust me, we tested it out. Throw the box, perfect. Okay.
Derek, you mentioned earlier on some discussions with some of your customers about modal shifts and those types of things. Are there some things that you're doing collaboratively with both customers and with other modal carriers to actually look at proactive moves for some of those volume shifts?
Yeah, so one of the things we try to do with any shipper of significance in our network is some cadence of quarterly business review. Now, sometimes you can't do it quarterly due to their schedules or ours, but during those reviews, one of the big things we're always trying to look for is, especially in a time of raising rates, I mean, rates are going up, that's a reality. That's not gonna go away, that's not a flash in the pan, that's real. But if I'm going in and we know rates are going up and they need to go up to be reinvestable, if I can offset some of that with modal shift and modal opportunities, we always want to bring that forth. So it's not uncommon at all that a dialogue might be a 6%, 7% type rate increase, and over half of that could be offset through either modal shift or economic changes in their network, i.e. that place that you say you have to have 5 hours to load, if it's brought down to a reasonable amount, the rate could stay where it is, but that's not going to happen until it's brought down. We've got a price for today and then plan for tomorrow. So those kind of modal analyses, if you will, are a big part of what we're trying to do every day to offset the cost. Because I still think we collaboratively as an industry can continue to take empty miles out, continue to take and find better both load and mode optimization. So optimizing by mode and then optimizing the load itself to cube out or weigh out even better, and offset a great majority, maybe not all, of what we're seeing from just a pure rate perspective. Unfortunately, there are still shippers that are out there that they're going to bid every year no matter what. They're going to redrop the pickup sticks, and the network's going to change every year. And that's stuff that we really think seriously about right now in this kind of capacity market. How much can you do business with a shipper like that? Because it affects everyone around them. If their network changes dramatically every year, it affects a bunch of other players in our network, and that's not necessarily right for them. And so we have more of an aversion to that than we would have otherwise had versus a negotiated rate process by which you can have stability in your network on those lanes.
So the second part of that was any collaborative discussions with, say, rail carriers as an example on potential opportunities for those shifts?
Yeah, so in our case, we don't own containers. We're traditional IMC. And so it would be very common that depending on the volumes, obviously, and the interest level of the underlying carrier, we would want to bring them to bear either with us in the meetings, which is not easy to do because they're not exactly sitting on a ton of capacity themselves or time. But if not, our team works collaboratively. So when a bid comes into our house, it's immediately, if it's intermodal eligible or we think modal conversion opportunities exist, it's shared with our rail partners. We try to collaborate and price it, and we try to give the shipper both sets of pricing.
Great question. Any other questions? Go ahead. Throw in the box.
Nobody wants to ask now because they don't want to catch it.
Yeah, this was the, in relation to the efficiency, 5%, and you mentioned very briefly the detention. That's one of the aspects actually that could help in that regard. But do you see digitizing of data, visibility, early visibility to information as one of the solutions, for instance, to take the 5% or reduce the 5% of inefficiency that exists today?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're on the precipice of a huge technology-based advancement in this industry. I talked, because of time, just about one, because it always tends to be a hot topic, which is all the autonomous and driver assist technology. But you think about what's going on in blockchain, you think about what's happening with APIs and the ability to more easily and readily interface and exchange data. I think that's the kind of stuff we ought to be focusing on. What we tend to do as an industry is get one side or the other really upset at any given point in time about one thing, which is rate. And if that's all we're focused on is rate, we're missing the bigger picture, which is there is still opportunity to make this all better and to mitigate any rising or lowering costs through more efficiency.
Okay, well, I'm getting
We got one more
One
here.
more.
one more. Okay.
Eric, have you tracked your average length of haul? What is happening with your average length of haul?
Yes, we have. Now, so we report, because we're publicly traded, and we report a consolidated statement of both dedicated and one-way. This won't foot to our consolidated statement, but I will tell you, because dedicated is a shorter length of haul, and we've been growing our dedicated division. But even in our one-way, so if you just took our one-way assets as a standalone, we have seen consistent, repeated reduction of length of haul over about a 5-year period, and then recently some stabilization. So as people have put up more and more regional distribution centers, as e-commerce plays a bigger role, as everything gets forward deployed, length of haul has continued to be compressed, which bodes well for service and next day deliveries and all of the things that consumers want. It bodes a little less well for opportunity for future modal conversion, because in my one-way network today, generally speaking, it's either too short to convert or it's team transit. And there's really not much else left. And so we still have all of these exercises we go through, and it's always trying to find that stuff, but it's harder to come by than it was 4 years ago, that's for sure.
Okay, so I'll wrap it with this final question. J.B. Hunt made some news when in the fourth quarter they sent out a letter to customers saying just to kind of brace yourself with everything that's going on, you might want to take a look at your 2018 budgets and factor in a 10% rate increase. I got a lot of notoriety. You and I talked about that type of thing. Now we're a month into 2018. Is that kind of a realistic assessment of the overall rate environment? I know it may vary from some accounts. Some might be higher, some might be lower. But is 10% a reasonable forecast for where you expect rates in 2018 to be, year over year?
You know, I apologize if I seem evasive, but the problem with rates is it's such a shipper-specific issue. There are shippers in our network today, somewhere in America right now as we sit, that are staring at a rate increase that's going to be significantly more than that. There are many others that are going to be lower than that. And it really comes down to the characteristics of the freight and whether we can continue to haul it and kind of put it into the network given its characteristics. So I'll tell you, I'll answer it slightly differently. I think as you've seen 3 or 4 announcements come out in the fourth quarter already, you're seeing 5% rate increase year over year in the fourth quarter 17 versus 16. That's prior to any bid season. That's prior to getting into contractual renewals. That's really spot market effect, peak season surcharge. There's no reason to believe, in my view, that you're going to see less than that as you go forward. So those goalposts are somewhere in that 5 and that outer side of 15, which lands you somewhere in the middle of 10. But that doesn't mean people's entire network move that far, because it depends on what your freight mix and your customer mix looks like. I think people better be diligent, they better be data driven, and they ought to be able to justify what they're asking for. But if it is justified, it needs to be done, because this industry is not at reinvestable levels, which is why it's been shrinking.
With that, I want to say thank you very much for your time. This could have gone on and on, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.